The heat waves that have occurred in Europe and Asia this summer have made it appear that the mainstream media has found evidence of a warming climate. However, more than 1,100 scientists and professionals around the world have signed a World Climate Declaration stating that there's no climate emergency.
Yes, this new World Climate Declaration, issued in June 2022, has got a lot of men in suits who look into video cameras in front of green screens in their bedrooms very excited. People have been invited to sign it, and it was so important it was presented to the United Nations and to the European Parliament. I thought at first this declaration was just another boring rant by amateurs railing against science, just like the petition against something called Darwinian theory, then the petition against CO2-induced warming. They don't really tell us much except to convince people who aren't very skeptical that scientific theories are some sort of popularity contest. And of course, they're trying to persuade politicians. But then I read the declaration, and I was wrong. It actually does tell us a lot, not for what it says, but for what it doesn't say, and for what it tries so hard to imply.
Snap, snap, grin, grin, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more.
So yes, I thought this is funny and disturbing enough to be worth a quick video. First, let's get one thing clear. It's not
The mainstream media
that's found evidence of a warming climate. The mainstream media don't even do climate research any more than most signatories of these petitions do. The evidence has been found by climate researchers and published in scientific journals. In fact, a lot of the mainstream media have spent the last 30 years rejecting the evidence of global warming. But why the carefully worded,
more than 1,100 scientists and professionals?
After all, scientists are professionals. So why not just say more than 1,100 professionals have signed this petition? To understand why, you have to understand who's organized the petition, a Dutch political lobby group called Clintel. The two founders wrote this carefully worded declaration, and to bump up the number of signatures, they invited anyone with a degree and a pulse to sign it. If you're a dentist or a stockbroker and you have strong feelings about climate science, you can sign the petition too. So you have to read the names on the petition to find out that a lot of these scientists are in fact lawyers, ship designers, political lobbyists, journalists, economists, mining company CEOs and business owners, and that's just a fraction of the signatories from Australia alone. A lot of the actual scientists signing the petition are aircraft engineers, doctors, seismologists, radiologists, industrial chemists, building engineers, mechanical engineers, and if you don't believe me, just take a look at the list. So how do we know they understand the first thing about climate science? We don't, of course. This is pretty much a cross-section of people you'll find in a posh village pub, and more on them later. But by calling the signatories scientists and professionals, that sounds very similar to saying professional scientists.
Know what I mean, nudge, nudge, know what I mean.
And then it's easy for men in suits in front of their bedroom green screens to transition this into a petition by scientists. And it's easy for one of the founders of Clintel, the aptly named Marcel Croc, to also portray these poets, lawyers and building engineers as real scientists trying to lecture crazy journalists on a subject neither group has ever studied. In reality, this petition doesn't come from scientists pushing back against the mainstream media. It's the complete opposite. This is another example of ordinary people who believe what they read in the media, pushing back against the science. Leaving that aside, I mentioned earlier that what's interesting about this petition isn't what it says, but what it doesn't say. The long-standing arguments that have now been dropped. Remember when amateurs like Christopher Monckton used to argue that the world wasn't warming?
No global warming at all for 17 years, 9 months.
Well, that claim has now been dropped. It's no surprise that we're experiencing a period of warming, says the declaration, in complete contradiction to Monckton's claims. And who's signed up to that? Why, it's Christopher Monckton. The petition goes even further. In the last declaration signed by assorted doctors and building engineers, the claim was that CO2 from burning fossil fuels won't disrupt the climate. And critics like Tim Ball and Ian Clarke used to argue that even if the world was warming, it had nothing to do with carbon dioxide.
No, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes.
Well, those claims have also been quietly dropped. Now there's an admission that as well as natural factors, anthropogenic factors also cause warming. In other words, carbon dioxide. Which means Ball and Clarke were wrong. But guess who's now signed up to that? Surprise, surprise, Tim Ball and Ian Clarke. Here's another one. Richard Lindzen and William Happer have long been pushing the belief that the Earth has some kind of self-regulating temperature mechanism.
There must be some kind of negative feedback that tends to keep the Earth's temperature about the same.
Tends to keep the Earth's temperature about the same? But as I've shown when I debunked both Lindzen and Happer, the Earth's temperature hasn't stayed about the same. It's varied considerably over geological time. So guess which side the petition comes down on. Earth's climate has varied as long as the planet has existed, with natural cold and warm phases, it says. You probably think I'm going to show you that Richard Lindzen and William Happer have both signed the petition that completely contradicts their earlier beliefs. Well, who am I to disappoint? But although these long-time critics finally admit that the Earth is warming, and that anthropogenic factors cause warming, and that there's no stabilizing mechanism to stop that happening, the only way to continue to sow doubt is through, of course, ambiguity, hints, and insinuation. First, when they say that both natural and anthropogenic factors cause warming, they deliberately don't specify any particular time period. So, as a general rule, this statement is true. Natural factors were responsible for past warming, and anthropogenic factors are responsible for warming now. The casual reader, however, would take this to mean that both factors are causing warming today. Obviously, the authors of the Declaration don't dare say that, because they'd be asked to explain what they think these natural factors might be, and that brings them up against hard science. So they have a let-out. They can imply that both factors are at work, and if they're challenged, simply deny the implication.
Look, are you trying to insinuate something?
No, 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 no.
Next, the Little Ice Age ended as recently as 1850. Yes, the Little Ice Age ended around 1850, but that was so long ago, I wonder why the word recently has been inserted. Let's keep reading and find out. Therefore, it's no surprise that we're now experiencing a period of warming. Well, of course, it is no surprise that we're experiencing a period of warming because CO2 is a strong greenhouse gas and CO2 concentration has been rising. The current warming period was predicted as far back as the 1950s and in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. So no one in climate research was at all surprised. But adding the word therefore implants the idea that whatever forcing caused the end of the Little Ice Age in the early 19th century, or recently, as they like to describe it, had something to do with warming today. Okay, so what was that? The Declaration doesn't say, of course, because if they clearly stated that the Little Ice Age had something to do with recent warming, they'd be forced to explain what that was, and that would mean tackling the science. Researchers have found that increased solar activity, measured by sunspot numbers that were observed at the time, was the most likely cause of the end of the Little Ice Age. As you can see here, the increase in solar activity at the time correlates very well with changes in global temperature. The warming was possibly enhanced by a decrease in volcanic activity that reduced aerosol concentration in the atmosphere. But if the authors were to suggest that the same thing is happening now, their petition would again be laughed at, because those factors clearly aren't responsible for recent warming. For the last 7 decades, solar irradiance has been stable and then falling, and aerosol concentration has been increasing, thanks to the industrial rise of India and China. If they suggest the warming was caused by changes in albedo or increased water vapor concentration, then that's also very easily disproved, because of course these are passive forcings, they're feedbacks. Even climate science critics know that. So instead, they don't explain anything. They just add a few adverbs and conjunctions to known facts, string them together, and hope the casual reader will get the impression that the Earth is warming now due to the same factors that ended the Little Ice Age.
A nod's as good as a wink to a blind bat.
And if he does, well, nothing to do with us, Gov.
No, 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 no.
That's the difference between slickly worded petitions signed by lawyers aimed at politicians and scientific papers aimed at research scientists. Researchers have to spell out exactly what they're proposing, the method by which they derived it, and any references they used. They have to show their data, their evidence, their calculations, and their results, so it can all be picked apart, scrutinized, and disproved if possible. Political lobbyists do the complete opposite. They daren't spell everything out. By leaving everything vague and ambiguous, they're trying to avoid having their claims scrutinized or challenged. Okay, let's press on to a claim made in the past by bloggers and lobbyists that CO2 is too tiny to have any effect.
Why do we suppose that carbon dioxide is responsible for our changing climate? CO2 forms only a very small part of the Earth's atmosphere.
Only 4% of our greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide.
It's an incredibly small portion.
Carbon dioxide is only a tiny trace gas in the atmosphere.
CO2 now occupies, get this, 1/10,000th more of the atmosphere than it did in 1750.
That claim is also missing from the petition. Instead, they argue the complete opposite. It turns out that this teeny tiny trace gas can have huge effects. CO2 is essential to all life on Earth, says the petition. Not only that, the supposedly teeny tiny increase in this teeny tiny trace gas has promoted growth in global plant biomass. Which of course it has, as I've explained in my videos and researchers have shown in several studies. So what happened to the people who thought that a teeny tiny increase in a teeny tiny trace gas can't possibly have any effect? Well, we've already seen that Christopher Monckton and Tim Ball have signed up to this new reality, and yes, so has Jay Lair of the Heartland Institute. The authors of the declaration do manage to make a few claims very explicitly, without innuendo, so consequently these can be pretty easily battered out of the ballpark. Warming is slower than predicted. The world has warmed significantly less than predicted by the IPCC on the basis of modelled anthropogenic forcing. The paragraph that follows also assumes the predictions were inaccurate. Of course, we only have to look at the predictions to see that that's nonsense. In its first report, the IPCC used this forecast by James Hansen. There were 3 scenarios. Scenario A was based on no action to curb greenhouse emissions and therefore accelerating CO2 growth. Scenario B was based on limited action to curb CO2 emissions and linear growth. And Scenario C was based on strong action to curb CO2 emissions and falling CO2 output. Thanks to the Kyoto Protocol, what we got was linear growth in CO2 concentration, and that matched Hansen's forecast pretty well. But if you're not happy with that, fine. This was the second IPCC forecast from 1995, and this one from 2001, and so on. All the predictions pretty much match the temperature rise we've seen. And even if you refuse to accept any of that and just want to focus on the estimate of climate sensitivity that most results cluster around, a 3 degrees centigrade rise for a doubling of CO2 from pre-industrial levels, that prediction is also right on track. These real predictions in the scientific literature, going back 40 years, have proved far more accurate than the predictions of some of the signatories to the petition. Just look at the contrast between James Hansen's prediction of average global temperatures and Richard Lindzen's. And what evidence do the authors of this petition present to back up their claim that warming is far slower than predicted? Of course, none at all. Let's try another statement that actually does make a definitive claim. Global warming has not increased natural disasters. There's no statistical evidence that global warming is intensifying hurricanes, floods, droughts, and such like natural disasters, or making them more frequent. The obvious question is, how do you know? have the authors done a statistical study of all the hurricanes, floods, droughts, and such like, and published their calculations to be read by all the signatories who unquestioningly believed it? If so, where's this study? Well, no, they haven't. So when they say there's no statistical evidence, it means they haven't seen any statistical evidence, and neither apparently have the 1,100 plus signatories who believe them. They're just busy foresters or hard-working coal experts who can't be bothered to wade through the scientific literature and find it easier just to put their names on a petition. But it's really not that hard to find this evidence. Just look at the intensity of hurricanes, because that's very easy to measure. I found several studies showing that they have indeed grown more intense. As for global warming making hurricanes more frequent, well, that's one of the effects the authors of the Declaration seem to think has been predicted as a result of global warming. But it hasn't. Climate researchers have always predicted the opposite, that hurricanes would become less frequent since global warming will reduce global wind circulation, and this will increase wind shear at the tops of hurricanes, chopping them off before they form. Only the most intense storms will survive. I covered this in a previous video. So there's a lesson in this. If you decide you want to oppose a scientific conclusion that you know very little about and start a petition, the first step is to at least find out what the scientific conclusion is. Otherwise, you find yourself opposing something that doesn't even exist. Now let's come back to those signatories, because I'm sure by now there'll be at least one post in the comments section saying, "But potholer, many of these signatories are actual climatologists." Well, they've certainly got themselves lots of interesting titles that have the word climatologist in them. Pavel Duder, excuse my pronunciation, must be a climatologist, you'd think, because he says he is. But he also says he's a publicist, and I can't find any record in the scientific literature of a climatologist called Pavel Duder. Lots of people seem to have given themselves the title of climate realist, which isn't a climatologist, and it isn't even a profession. They seem to practice being a climate realist in their spare time because they have other qualifications like urologist. Oh, I do beg your pardon. This guy is an informed climate realist. That's all right then. One guy calls himself a climate policy commentator. Real job, anthropologist. There are lots of people who belong to climate lobbying groups. That still doesn't make them climatologists. And being a building engineer who reads climate blogs doesn't make you a climate researcher, even if you're so convinced you are one that you write it twice. Okay, you might say, but aren't geologists or geophysicists climatologists? No, of course not. I checked the credentials of some of the geologists on the list, and they're mostly involved in mining geology or other fields like seismology or mineralogy. Out of the entire list, I could only find a handful who had any kind of relevant qualification in the field of climatology. Oh, potholer, you may remonstrate, you're being an elitist, suggesting that only people with relevant qualifications should get to sign a petition about a scientific conclusion. No, I'm not saying that at all. First and foremost, people with relevant qualifications don't go around making vague insinuations in a petition if they don't like a particular scientific theory. That's not how science is done. They publish their evidence clearly and precisely in scientific journals where it can be publicly scrutinized and disproved. Secondly, if a group of doctors and architects don't like a particular scientific theory, so what? How is that different to regulars at the local pub deciding they disagree with the theory of gravity? Should politicians now make policy decisions about scientific issues like disease control and earthquake mitigation based on what a bunch of pub-goers sign up to? I'm also saying there's something far more interesting here than just a bunch of amateurs deciding they're not happy with the conclusions of climate scientists. We've seen that before. What's different is a huge shift in position. Many of the signatories are bloggers and lobbyists who've long disliked the conclusion that the Earth is warming and that carbon dioxide is responsible, or even that it could warm. None of those arguments is stated in this new petition, and most are completely contradicted. And in place of doubt, which has been the mainstay of the anti-science lobby, from creationists to tobacco firms to political groups, we now have something far more wussy: ambiguity. Whereas before they would have wheeled out a few old retired climatologists to say maybe all the other climatologists are wrong, now the best they can do is drop hints.
Look, are you trying to insinuate something?
No, 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 no. Yes.
I guess catching up to the science of 1955 is progress, right? One last thing. Of course, I don't monetize my channel. I don't ask for donations. But if you'd like me to keep this channel going, I am very encouraged by donations given to a charity that I support. You'll find all the details in the video description. So, even if you don't want to help me out, at least please help the charity. Thanks a lot.